Hello everyone, today we talk about the Brabançons within the context of the clashes between the Angevins, the Capetians, other houses in France. We already introduced the Brabançons in a very old video of Schwerpunkt. We're talking, I think, 2019, almost 2020. Epic time in the channel's history. If anything, at some point we could make a history of that kind. And that, however, we haven't discussed further much more. Yes, I made videos about medieval mercenaries, so we, of course, mentioned the Brabançons. We also made lots of videos about the Low Countries that they were originary of. We even made a video about the Duchy of Brabant. That is essentially the synecdochal onomastic of the case. We just recently discussed figures like, for example, William Marshal. We talked a bit more French, English warfare, admittedly just about the 100 Years' War, so not much today's time. That is roughly the fourth quarter of the 12th century. However, you're aware of the general context. We also made lots of videos about Bouvines, that is a bit later, but is still part of this great struggle. We're talking the same generation of Henry II of England's sons that we already covered in some introductory videos about probably Plantagenet, early Plantagenet England, etc. So you know what we're talking about, and we will have ample opportunity here to digress on different aspects of this military history. So we will observe, in theory, of these clashes, so not merely from the beginning to the end, some Brabançon employment, action, in general, role in this pretty heated clash. In a moment, as you know, as we've also recapped in a recent video about the consolidation of the so-called feudal monarchies, was witnessing an important statal sort of escalation, so to say, especially in France and England, that entailed an ever more professionally, if anything, properly monetarily retributed military force, which was, in fact, gradually to substitute at least the chronically dysfunctional, and in fact, to some point, just name only, right, process of feudal vassalic beneficiary recruitment. I made plenty of video on this specific topic, and naturally, France, England are the sort of top examples, just by documentary evidence, by national political compaction, and so on. You understand that this Brabançon, that also following a general dynamic of the era, and not only, were essentially coming from fringe areas of Europe, not necessarily even the more developed, or at least Flanders was admittedly rich. At this point, was yet fully take off. It's still a feudal country, but definitely there are some estates that are, in fact, emerging in the suburban world of the Flemish towns that at some point are also impoverished, and they go out for war. There is a general demographic growth, very interesting dynamics. If anything, we will discuss from the same Brabançon's origin in another video. Today, we look just at the military history of an evenemental story of their employment in this neighboring and quite quarrelsome, warlike feudal monarchies just next door to the Low Countries. Right. If you're interested, you can check out my Flemish history playlist. You'll find plenty of this information. So basically, we started in 1183 when hired mercenary groups were once more engaged in the disputes among Henry II's sons. Henry II, 1133-1189, was the first proper Plantagenet king of England, who ruled from 1154. Which is also an interesting parallelism with Frederick Barbarossa in Germany. And there was a lot of meeting ground. If you look at Philip of Alsace, that was a renowned Flemish Low Countries knight that also served as an imperial vassal, Barbarossa, against the Lombard League, but also trained, for example, Henry's so-called young prince, Henry Young Prince, in the arts and crafts of war, and the ruses of the same that were practiced in tournaments at this time. So it's almost, as we've seen in the video about William Marshal, say, a fairy tale moment as far as knightly chivalric ideals are consolidating, also in the more sort of conventional sense that we attributed to the Middle Ages at large. The context is the peak of the so-called Angevin Empire across England, Normandy, Anjou, and Aquitaine. Never really made a video about the Angevin Empire as such, also because, as you know, together with the Venetian Empire, other empires in general, it's a bit like a grandiose historiographical term that was also historiographically debunked at some point. There was not really an empire as we could sort of conventionally understand. It was mostly like a dynastic sum of feudal domains that the House of Anjou, the Plantagenets that had now risen to the kingship of England, retained control of. Surely also true, sort of core, sort of England critical mass that was by far the most important of this territory. But that at large was in fact not very much overly connected with the entire world. And the same Angevin kings of England that are essentially Frenchmen, and in general, many of also the actual English barons, in the sense that at least those barons who owned their lands in England were also French noblemen. They had titles across the Channel and preferred to spend most of their time there, as a matter of fact. Also plundering for the convenience of England, the pretty, at least fragmented French territories at this point. If it wasn't for the fact that, in fact, the critical mass of France was coagulating further, by the way, around, of course, the Ile-de-France, so the French crown possessions, and it would turn out to be the Angevin Empire to be the more vulnerable and fragmented and not actually unitary and cohesive. Nevertheless, at this point, the balance was pretty even, you could say, and generally speaking, we say that given at least this nominal possessions, the Plantagenet King of England was, in the sense, more powerful than the same King of France. It's a complicated story. Again, never really made a video specifically on that. We can look at it in other videos. It's an immense power that Henry II and his sons have, and one that can cripple Capetian monarchic consolidation, but that at the end of the day will actually fail in doing so. All right, and the House of Anjou will pass to the Capetians. That actually created the more important Angevin, so to say, power, mostly in southern Italy, but also in southern France. And again, also in this case, we say Angevin because Charles of Anjou was of the House of Anjou, as the House of the Capetians, as the most important princely possession in France, right? But also for some cultural national reason, nobody seems to care about the much more powerful French Angevin Empire as opposed to the so-called quote-unquote English one early on. The younger Henry, that we were just mentioning before, known as Henry the Young King, 1155-1183, was crowned as junior king in 1170, so was associated to the throne with his father, but without, in fact, a real royal prerogatives, leading to familial tensions alongside Geoffroy II, Duke of Brittany, 1158-1186, who inherited, at this point, Brittany through his marriage to Constance, the Duchess of Brittany, that also had Scottish, English ancestors. It's a complicated story. Again, I made a video about medieval Brittany if you're interested in this quite troubled succession. Brittany was a bit less sort of centrally controllable, both from the within and from the outside. And so it was territory where this conflict escalated, but was now controlled by Geoffrey, whatever you want to call it. That was also, in fact, one of the sons of Henry II. And Henry and Geoffrey initiated an attack on their brother, Richard the Lionheart, that would be, not quite too many years, 1157, 1199, King of England in himself, notorious knightly hero, famous for his bravery, especially in the Third Crusade of 1189-1192. And that was also Duke of Aquitaine from 1172. This was a historical issue given the aforementioned composite nature of the Angevin Empire, and the fact that every prince wanted to have, say, a portion of it and was ready to fight against his brothers and even his father. And this is basically the destiny of all these rulers to get that. And of course, there is a nobility that doesn't want in the moment the monarch to become too powerful, will side with these kids that, however, will succeed to the throne. So in this case, Richard, for example, was backed by his father. All right. And Geoffrey thus and Henry were properly finding out from within, like all across the channel. Geoffrey allowed his paid fighters to pillage the territories belonging to Richard and their father. The so-called treacherous Brabanson band, condemned and excommunicated by the church, by the way, because had so many heretics among them, many Cathars, right? As you know, made pretty notorious videos about the Cathar ideology. It was a counterculture. It's as if today, again, these were the most fascinerous, extremistic, leftistic, anti-establishment thing that as desperates were just being hired with these ideas to destabilize the system, in this case, siding, for example, against the same English crown and at least the possessions of Henry II also in France. These Brabançons were famous for being mostly foot soldiers from the Duchy of Brabant. This is the stereotype, as we said before. The Duchy of Brabant was to become essentially the most important medieval polity in the Low Countries, roughly modern-day Belgium and the Netherlands. And the Brabançons were so countercultural that their type of combat stood out for, in fact, its relative unconventionality. They were famous for their long lances, crossbows, and brutal tactics. First documented in 1166 as unemployed veterans from regional wars that surely were not lacking in these times and places. And that were understood in this sense as the anti-establishment, thus in open field, the anti-cavalry, the anti-knightly forces. The development of Flemish infantry is very interesting because after the Italians, fundamentally, these were the areas that had at least the most markedly, or even the most markedly infantry-based forces out there. Really, Flemish armies would have not actually stronger infantries, but at least given that there were coalitions of towns at some point that, especially during the 13th century, got a bit rid of the overarching feudal structure that in any case will remain in the County of Flanders and beyond, coalesced with local leagues mostly composed by third estaters. Right? These were not really city-states. They had, of course, their own cavalry forces. Brabançons were not a political expression of the Low Countries in a conventional sense. But they came from these places, and even though they also conventionally fought with mounted troops and towards a more tendentially sort of conventional, in fact, type of combat, and especially integrating with these, here you see, English royalty, basically, so knightly armies and so on, were famed for their anti-cavalry ethos and ideology, so they were not overwhelmingly sort of qualitative just for their specific tactics. They just were because they were starting to be all-round professional troops as mercenaries, just living out of this, right, from the general surplus of people and wealth that was unevenly available politically, societally in these times and places of Western Europe. The Brabançons, at the service of Henry the Young King, ravaged Henry II's lands. We're in France here, as we will see also from the geographical details, of course. They would have not been admitted in England. Of course, there were some Brabançons even there, but they're more famously sort of involved in the pretty tumultuous and chaotic at times French theater, a bit like, free companies in after the Treaty of Bretigny during the 100 Years' War that we also covered in other videos. This was happening despite Henry II having, in 1173, quote, relied on them more than his other forces, right? Because, of course, also Henry had fought in France, and these guys were just available. We know this phrase from the Gesta Regis Henrici Secundi, so literally the biography, the deeds of Henry II. So there was really nothing strange about their use. This was a phase when the papacy, for example, issued a ban for crossbows that gets often misinterpreted as if the church was literally thinking it could ban crossbows from warfare. This is not what it meant. It meant that the lay establishment, also the bishop, the military bishops at some point, could use these weapons. But since there was a social instance here of rebellious estates against constituted order, the idea was an effort to pacifying, to disarm these sort of unhinged masses of marauders, people who literally massacre noblemen, bishops across France without much control, exploiting the political vacuum and so on. So again, if you use crossbows against the Saracens, was fine. Crossbows were used everywhere in Europe, for that matter, without anyone even imagining to be able to control their spread. But it was mostly targeting groups that made of this anti-cavalry web, because they were at some point effective. At least they caused lots of damage against cavalry. They were not the game changer. They all operated in combined arms tactics with the same mounted forces, and they could create issues on a general basis. And they were not considered proper sort of weapons like spears, swords, so the missiles always inferior, always vile, considering from a chivalric mentality, except also knights use extensively this weapons, also from horseback. It's totally normal. However, they can be excused as sort of side weapons that were being attentively banned. Thus, these Brabançons, originating from Brabant in the Low Countries, again, it's synecdoche, they came from many different places, but mostly the Flanders, were notorious for their discipline and ferocity. So a great combination of sort of collective capacity, but also moral force, making them highly sought after despite their excommunication. So their anti-establishment heretical rule. Prince Henry ensured timely payments to his Brabançons because they were that reliable and effective. Where they made also switch allegiance to his father for higher wages. Here we're talking about Henry the Young Prince. This was true for sort of all players involved. Naturally, we could digress further on the ideology of the Brabançon for the few that we know in general, but if you study the videos about Catholicism, you find everything there. Surely there were also Catholics among them. It's not like they were all heretics, but their political stance was to sort of anti-establishment to be tolerated in the way that in this chaos, this hellish military theaters, of course, they were, however, the best devils to summon. Facing financial strain, Henry the Young Prince, because warfare was crushingly expensive, extorted substantial sums from the citizens of his own towns and appropriated treasures from Saint-Martial at Limoges. The Abbey of Saint-Martial was a Benedictine monastery in the main center of the Limousin, in fact, after the Limoges, area of south-central France. Part of the county of Limousin, you can make a video about that, politically under the lordship of the Duke of Aquitaine. Nobody really cared about these towns, these centers. Generally speaking, the Guyenne was, because of its Atlantic connections with England, more readily supplied and respected by the English. As far as this broader... I made a video about the medieval Aquitaine that explains, as opposed to the Dutch, it was actually just a small part of what we consider Aquitaine in a broader sense. In fact, controlled all these other polities that just eventually, just by approximation, given that they weren't particularly autonomous on their own terms, but if anything by scale, were under the lordship of the Duke of Aquitaine. The system was very fragmented anyhow, right? This region had not been historically organized by a major regional force like the one of Neustria, the Ile-de-France, from centuries. If anything, they had been always frontier areas, especially in the hinterland, disconnected from other major routes. And so relatively easy prey, even of those who should have protected them, like in this case. It's not like Henry necessarily wanted to abuse these communities, but he needed resources. And so, considering what was at stake, controlling the entire Angevin Empire, that seemed worth it. He also naturally plundered other nearby churches and monasteries and reduced prices to pay his troops. You understand that if you have heretical soldiers doing this, they are sort of also the ones that can be scapegoated conveniently in a moral sense for it, and they're going to be eager to destroy church property, killing priests and so on. The Count of Turenne, Boson III, died roughly around 1194. The Count of Turenne is in the Mark of Limousin. Bolstered these forces with a group of Basques from Gascony. Gascony, that we also made a video on, in particular the Duchy, right, that located in southwestern France, and under de facto English control since the 12th century, inhabited by the Basque people, replaced an ethnic group with a distinct language and culture in the Pyrenees regions that had never too well appreciated French interference in their affairs during the periodical reactivation of Frankish power, were notorious for their, in fact, frontier warfare, guerrilla capacities. I made a video about the Bidots, that were essentially a light type of infantry, or at least a lighter type of infantry. They had heavies among them. The Brabançons are credited to be heavier, as we've seen at the Battle of Bouvines. They basically formed a circle and fought to the death, even when the rest of the Anglo-German force had been destroyed by the French, taking down with them lots of knights of the victorious army of Philip Augustus, Philip II of France. So these were yet another countercultural force, just out of the sheer sort of primitivity of their background. These forces were enlisted by Sancho of Savagnac, that was a minor Gascon noble and recruiter, and Courban of Courbaran, a notorious routier leader with possibly even mixed ancestry. Philip Augustus, Philip II, 1165-1223, King of France from 1180, nicknamed Augustus for his especially later territorial expansion, as you know, with Bouvines, had a very high sense of traditional spirituality of sacred royalty, and transformed the French monarch into a much more powerful polity, provided a diverse contingent known as Paleari or Payé. Naturally, here Philip II was siding with the rebels, hoping Henry II to be defeated. And therefore, this quite mixed group, as we've seen, of different, Brabançons, Aquitanians, Basques, Frenchmen, and others, often including routier, the etymology of which being organized into route or companies, distinct from feudal levies, but there are also other meanings proposed, as well as other itinerant fighters that were never too far away, was known for its lack of loyalty to any single lord, right, serving only for pay. Thus, the objective was just damaging Henry II's power, reputation. It was difficult, of course, to find the means with just part of your domains having rebel against you to counter these forces, especially across the Channel. Collectively, these units formed a nefarious band of mercenaries. The sudden death of young Henry on June 11th, 1183, led, however, to the political collapse of the rebellion against Henry II. Left without a cause, the aforementioned mercenaries brutally plundered southwestern France, something oddly similar to, again, the post-Bretigny treaty, free companies. The dynamics are always the same. You can find them scattered in the ranks of French history with, say, I don't know, the French War of Religion, the Viking incursions. We'll talk about this further. This area encompassing Aquitaine, Gascony, and Limousin, key to the Angevin Empire's southern holdings, was essentially to partially pay also for the loss of control over this critical mass of rowdy mercenaries. That also soon secured new contracts in the conflicts between Richard I and Philip Augustus. Richard formed a permanent army, at least for the time standards, meaning sort of continuously paid corps of military professionals, to safeguard his realm and sustain the extended wars he faced. Right. His knights generally received a shilling daily, while in Wales, the Principality of Wales, a Celtic polity in Western Britain under loose English overlordship, known for its rugged terrain and warrior traditions. We also made a video about Edward I's conquest of Wales. Richard hired infantry, paid 2 pence per day, and cavalry earned 4 pence for 1 horse or 6 pence for 2. Right, this gives you also a pretty concrete proportion of the tactical relevance of the various arms. Cavalry was dominant, but infantry was also capable, especially of these mercenary pikemen at Similia, to face in open ground the same heavy cavalry, or at least in other tactical contexts where the latter could find itself in greater difficulty. Again, I'll make more videos about the story of Flemish infantry revolution, because it's relatively undertoned, but still, especially in these earlier centuries, but there are lots of experiments that were carrying out, killing noblemen, ambushing knights, and so on. So they knew their deal, and especially the experience was mature in this broader clashes between the French and the English crowns. This tiered payment structure would just, this by the way reflected the economic realities, also maintaining a pretty varied but cooperative fighting force, with mounted troops valued higher for their shock capacity, mobility, and the general dominance on the battlefields of that era. By the way, these are exactly the years in which cavalry is taking off beyond what infantry can contrast it like. Right, infantry this is a very important aspect of Western Europe that I think it's unique by degree, by top degree. That is to say, the development of feudal states did not choke the development of infantry forces, of communal power, and so on. In part, of course, there was a cost that the subjected communities had to pay. For example, look at the Normans in southern Italy, how they basically choked a nascent communal development there, differently from the center and the north of the peninsula. However, you see that, in fact, the same north, in Italy, still cavalry was dominant with the local knights. This is the same case here. You can have an episode like the one of the Brabançons à Bouvines, getting themselves chopped to pieces, very, very tough nut to crack, but still failing, still being defeated against, at that point, the very triumph, Bouvines being the very triumph of feudal chivalric warfare. In a broader political and statal sense, other than just military, tactical, Richard also employed Genoese crossbowmen that he would also bring with him in the Holy Land, right? That was at least also populated by these Italian forces. The Genoese crossbowmen were used by Richard as mercenaries in Normandy. What is interesting, by the way, is that these Genoese crossbowmen were used by Richard already before the Crusade, right? There is all a literature, including, I don't know, the Pass Nicole, people that had a very high specific weight for different reasons, in sort of especially the disclosing of medieval warfare at some relatively popular level that for some reason the West got everything from the East, and or at least, especially in the fields of technology, there would have been some alleged sense of mechanistic copy dynamic where, I don't know, the exposure of the Westerners to the Levant would have like informed them with such advanced technologies. The more I studied medieval warfare for a long time, right, and from decades now, and I've never actually found a single indicator that this was the case. On the contrary, all evidence at my disposal suggests that the Westerners were not just developing their arms and armor in parallel and at a general, scale, basically, of the most advanced civilizations of the time, that they probably topped, but that in fact they were already themselves more technologically advanced than the Westerners. We know pretty well that, again, that there is a cliche. Sometimes a scholar says something remains copied as hearsay, right? Richard Lionheart was the first guy who introduced the crossbow in England because of Crusades, man. No, right? I mean, crossbows existed also in the darkest Pictish era in northern Britain during the early Middle Ages. Crossbows had always been around. The Normans of William the Conqueror brought them further to England. That were also the Anglo-Danes used them. The Vikings, everybody used them, and evidently the Genoese at this point also did quite well, as they were already prized by Richard Lionheart. These were yet other professionals that, however, differently from these rowdy bands of sort of random mortiers, were actually contracted by the Genoese Republic in a quite tidily, orderly fashion. Perhaps in these earlier times, not quite so directly, or at least with that enormously high level of control, but these were specific Genoese citizens that also made a living out there as mercenaries, but to come back to Genoa in particular as Genoese citizens, which was something different from a Brabançon coming back, say, home, and having to deal with local feudal lords, and having also relatively undeveloped militia level kind of military organization at their own infantry level, right? Not evidently at a knightly mounted one, because we've seen how in the Low Countries there is some sort of leopard skin distribution of, say, feudalism, towns, whatever. Obviously, they superimpose one another all the time, but it's also not again in a city-state system with also professional corps of troops properly guided by the cities and large forces of tens of thousands by single or policies. There isn't anything like that. Around 1180, if anything, so post-Crusade, it seems that Richard utilized Saracens, Muslim soldiers from the Levant, probably recruited after the Third Crusade for their tactical expertise, but possibly also connected with Spain. The aforementioned names of Basque, etc., could have actually provided with some, Muslim from the Iberian Peninsula, also in the ranks of these mortiers, right? We don't have any, I think, necessarily explicit, specific evidence, especially in this context, but again, this would have also been normal. The civilizations were very advanced, were very interconnected, so there is nothing strange and funny in these troops, even in England. But mostly we're looking at France and southwestern France, where, again, everything could be done more easily for the English not to be too perturbed and especially burdened. Because as we explained, fighting overseas, like essentially supplying yourself with this from these foreign communities, either friend or enemy, is quite convenient for your insular homeland. Provided that, again, these French territories are considered more of a homeland by the Angevin kings of England than England itself. And together with all the prestige that came from, again, being more powerful, having more territories than the King of France to an extent, and battling literally against the same to assert broader dominance. It's the general theme of the 100 Years' War. Also with important dynastic interconnections already in the 12th century. So you find a proclivity to use mercenaries. We will see this also as notoriously in the efforts of Philip II Augustus, who preferred by far mercenaries, which at the end of the day is just soldiers, right? So, paid, sort of semi-permanently paid military professionals, while he had sent his rowdy French noblemen from the north, from the Languedoc, to fight unbridled against the Catars of southern France, of Occitania, say better, which is also understandable, as we explained that, for example, those people shared lots of ideas, even with their Brabançons, trying to resist a broader establishment, the greater concentrating powers of the King of France, and so on. The Genoese were prized for their advanced crossbow technology. The Saracens brought expertise in mounted archery at this, in a broader and typical sense. This would have been learned and appreciated by Richard in the Holy Land. The bulk of Richard's mercenaries were, however, Brabançons, recruited by the celebrated leader Mercadier. I really want to make a military biography of the guy. Mercadier was a Provençal routier captain from the county of Provence, a Mediterranean polity under the Holy Roman Empire, so in the kingdom of Arles/Burgundy. He died around 1200. He rose from obscurity, as many of these mercenary captains, to become Richard's indispensable lieutenant, commanding up to 3,000 men drawn from various regions of Western Europe. Mercadier, being a Provençal, however, lacked support from the English nobility. Right, later, as you know, in the 13th century, Savoyards from very close places will gain a very important foothold in the English court. They would bring troops from their homeland. The Mercadier was, however, a great organizer, even more than a leader of men, right? He knew exactly the market of these professionals and so on. It was rather his outsider status combined with his ruthless efficiency to make him a polarizing figure among Richard's court. His mercenary commanders in southwestern France, because he controlled the various companies at the same time, we studied the company and its emergence, especially in this very era, as the basic organic. I mean, it already existed before as actual companies. I mean, maniples are companies. There is something really recurring in terms of decimal organization and human sort of cognitive limits regarding these. The most tactically protagonistic units in open field that could be, however, put together in larger battle lines, so some sort of regiments that were not permanent, were very far from that, but were arrayed as such in the main battle line. This guy's commanders included a Gascon named Arnold, a typical Gascon knight exemplifying the region's hardy fighters loyal to Aquitaine, land of chivalric epos, as you know, from Richard's mother Eleanor, whose children basically were scattered not just all across the most important Western polities at the time, but they had all a great sort of musical talent, as the Minnesänger, the troubadour, and in the case of males, probably very much associated, as we know, peak of male creativity is peak of male crime as well, so violence, knightly exploit, etc. Then there was Lupacius, likely a variant of Lupescare, Provençal captain, probably emerging also as a routier in the chaotic post-rebellion vacuum, who rose as a mercenary captain in southern France in the autumn of 1183. That October, Lupacius, by the way, lupus is a very frequent name also among the Basques, their equivalent, also adopted from Romance language, and was also reminiscent from the older sort of Ulfednar's bands of animal warriors, this is just some sort of, it may be a nickname, but surely was inspired to that older legend. After all, these were still scattered along also the highest nobiliar circles in the West, besieged Pompadour, a fortified castle in the Limousin, seat of the Viscounts of Pompadour, a strategic Angevin outpost, and laid waste to the surrounding area. Constant de Born, a minor Limousin noble from the castle of Born in Périgord, brother of the most famous poet instead, Bertrand, 1140-1215, circa, Viscount of Hautefort, still in the Limousin, a renowned Occitan troubadour, famous for his Cervantes, so satirical war songs of inciting feudal strife, provocations. Later, by the way, condemned in Dante's Inferno as a sower of discord, took part in these actions. Bertrand's poetry often glorified the martial exploit of such campaigns, reflecting the cultural impact of mercenary warfare in the region. It's notorious that knights were pretty exalted by their self-sacrifice in holy combat. I made a video probably about 12th century combat psychology, discussing the same knightly compositions were surely ideal. They were totally fine with warfare, also because they tasted it firsthand, but they still attributed a traditionally superior and hopefully righteous meaning through their actions of violence, and they enjoyed the hype, the excitement, the imperium wielding, so to say. At this point, Mercadier, however, withdrew his forces upon hearing of a planned attack by a brotherhood from Auvergne. The brotherhood was a regional militia alliance from the county of Auvergne, as you know, central France, a quite mountainous policy resisting Angevin incursions, a quite wooded rugged terrain. In 1184, Mercadier joined the service of Richard himself. Then the Duke of Aquitaine controlled thanks the disposition of Eleanor, whose favorite son Richard was, right? And as such also a perennial source of Plantagenet French tensions. As you know, Eleanor, before marrying Henry II and having really many children, had birthed only daughters as the former wife of Louis VII of France. And under the Duke's protection, Mercadier assaulted and devastated the lands of Count Adhemar of Limoges. Adhemar V died in 1199, a rebellious vassal in the Limousin whose disputes with Richard escalated into open war. 4 years later, by the way, the source for all the stuff, largely at least, is Godfrey Aubry. So you can check that source. 4 years later, Richard, with Brabançon support, battled the Count of Toulouse, Raymond V, 1134-1194, a semi-independent southern ruler allied with anti-Angevin forces. The Count of Toulouse wanted to keep everybody out. Doesn't matter whether they were, from the Capetians or Angevins. They were still Frenchmen and they couldn't stand them. Capturing 17 castles near Toulouse, however. These castles were strategic strongholds, vital for controlling the volatile region of Aquitaine as well as the southern frontier, right, a defensive security belt. Richard was concentrating important strategic assets to secure further his southern flank, from which he could launch raids into the north and northeast against the Capetians. Mercadier likely managed these castles for the king, by the way. As evidence suggests, he loyally defended them and led Richard's forces in the process. So, again, these were factota at large, hiring troops, commanding them, billeting them, scattering them, organizing them into garrisons, becoming the supervisors of all this control. So Mercadier is really a key figure we will surely make, together with Bertrand de Born and other sort of famous names we mentioned, lots of sort of biographies, because they really deserve as characters in this context. Mercadier accompanied the king on the Third Crusade, even, but was sent back when Philip Augustus left Acre, the major crusader port in the Kingdom of Jerusalem. I also made a video about the siege of Acre in the end of the 13th century when it was lost to the Mamluks. Mercadier had thus to come back to France, specifically tasked with protecting the king's territories with his mercenaries. This decision underscored Richard's trust in Mercadier's ability to maintain order in his absence. So obviously we're talking about Richard's territories, as essentially the King of France was coming back home, and as Richard, as you know, had also a pretty tumultuous journey during his stay in the Holy Land, but especially in his way back, when he was in prison, etc. So Mercadier was sort of trusted enough by Richard to maintain control, so politically, strategically, in France during his absence. From May 1194 until Richard's death nearly 5 years later, Mercadier was the king's vital ally. Thus, together they secured a major triumph at Fréteval, July the 3rd, 1194. This was essentially an ambush in the Loire Valley where Richard's forces routed Philip's army, capturing royal archives and siege equipment, by the way, forcing Philip to flee and later establish a permanent French National Library in Paris. You may think this to be an odd note, but literally because courts had largely been itinerant, or at least these archives were carried with the king, he started thinking, together with lots of things, Philip Augustus is the guy who passes properly from the official title in Latin, from king of the Western Franks and so on, to properly for the realm, Royaume de France. He creates properly France as opposed to Western Frankish state, of which Paris naturally was a sounder capital than it had been. So rather than risking the monarchy's archives on campaign, the library of Paris was the right place where to store and protect. So we are in 1194 with Battle of Fréteval, and early the next year, Mercadier seized Issoudun, a fortified town in Berry. Made a video about this land in central France, pretty much in the heartland, in fact, the geographic center of France proper. As we've seen, a counter disputed between Angevins and Capetians for a substantial amount of time, and establishing a garrison there, Rigaud, as narrated by the Gesta Philippi Augusti. Mercadier also campaigned in Brittany, allied with Geoffroy there. This theater would become a frequent battleground. Mercadier also led a raid on Abbeville, a market town in Picardy, in northeastern France, under Capetian control, a hub for Flemish trade routes, looting French merchants and amassing significant spoils. So you have this shift also in the theater of the operations from the west to the east, as generally speaking, as you know, a Capetian expansion, we've seen it very often in videos, for example, about the Artois, etc., was trying to take control of Flanders that were actually, for the most part, territorially speaking, historical Western Frankish kingdom, and yet also see of this, as we've seen, quite not appreciated Flemish powers and their Brabançons. So the English had historically always infiltrated in the Low Country. Think about the Battle of Bouvines, and also how the English linked up, lots of English mercenaries in particular linking up to with the Germans also of Brunswick. In 1197, Mercadier ambushed and captured the warlike Bishop of Beauvais, Philip of Dreux, died 1217. This was also one of the most important diocese in Picardy, and the same bishop was a Capetian prince himself, an aggressive military commander supporting Philip Augustus. We are told by the Rigaud, the Gesta Philippi Augusti, of this incident. It's important because warrior bishops, as we know, existed. They were present also in France. Given that at the Battle of Bouvines he unhorsed William Longsword and took him prisoner, so he had his redemption and satisfaction there, also in the broader context of the French triumph at Bouvines. Nevertheless, his earlier capture in the moment as a key supporter of Philip Augustus was a significant blow to Capetian morale and definitely inflating the Angevin won instead such a great prize in their hands. The following year, Richard and Mercadier blocked the French retreat at Vernon, a Seine river town in Normandy, site of a key bridge and ford, forcing the defeated troops into the Epte River, border river, in fact, between Normandy and the French royal domain, towards whom these French troops were fleeing, toward the Ile-de-France. Richard and Mercadier captured the castle of Courcelles-sur-Seine, yet another Norman fortress near Vernon, intercepted Philip Augustus' army sent to aid, and achieved yet another victory, chasing the fleeing forces to Gisors, a major Norman castle in the Vexin area, a border mark between, in fact, again, Normandy and sort of France, intended as Capetian crown lands. The chaos at the castle gate was so great that Philip Augustus fell into the moat when the bridge collapsed under his knights. This humiliating incident became celebrated and acted in Richard's propaganda efforts, and this was also the measure, of course, of the ups and downs, so to say, of sacred royalty as well, because symbolically speaking, a guy falling into the mud was definitely not very edifying. When Richard was fatally wounded, however, on March the 26th, 1199, during the siege of Count Adhémars of Limoges castle at Chabrol, really a minor castle in the Limousin, besieged over a treasure dispute involving a gold statue found there, Mercadier's physician attended the same king. Mercadier then stormed the castle to avenge his master's death. There are different anecdotes of what happened to the guy that apparently Richard was just playing with. Like, the guy was a boy, really, was shooting at the king with his crossbow, and the king was just sort of avoiding the shots, of parrying it with a shield until, as you know, he was mortally wounded. It wasn't even a mortal wound per se, but it was untreated. Richard sort of, was ashamed. Didn't show his soldier was wounded, and the wound infected, and until it was too late, really. While serving John, 1166-1216, King of England from 1199, known as Lackland, at least for his initial lack of territories, whose rule sparked the First Barons' War. I personally think John was a capable leader and also a successful ruler to the extent he found what he found himself in. In any case, this is a highly unpopular opinion, but I will explain further at some point why. The same Mercadier, it was still around, disciplined the rebellious city of Angers, the capital of Anjou, and so what the Plantagenet pride was in identity and ancestry and how it was connected with, and was later, however, as finally killed in Bordeaux, the chief city of Gascony, the vital English wine port, where on April the 10th, 1200. His death, reportedly in a skirmish, marked the end of a storied career that had shaped Richard's military successes. Like William of Ypres, died in 1148, a Flemish mercenary captain who led routier for King Stephen during the anarchy, so-called anarchy, 1135-1153, England's civil war under the aforementioned ruler, 1092, roughly 1154, and ruling in England from 1135, whose contested reign against Empress Matilda plunged England into chaos. Mercadier fought relentlessly for Richard, but remained a commoner, never elevated to nobility. This was also part of the reason for the contempt against his position. This is fascinating because the French, especially from the 13th century will make ever larger use, as you know, of a third estate for personnel to administrate the country, next, of course, to the nobility, the communal councils and so on. And so by that point, the English had lost almost everything, as you know, aside from Guyenne in the continent. But if you look at what Richard was doing and the cooptation of this, again, commoner that had just been a great leader, administrator, organizer, broker, etc., you realize that was the path also under an enlightened, capable, so-called firm ruler like Richard, in order to sort of agglutinate for this Angevin so-called empire, had it also successfully beaten the Capetian, so allowed for some kind of French state building from the English side. It's also noteworthy to stress that, again, in spite of the commoner's background, Mercadier always held his master's complete trust. In Château-Gaillard, a massive concentric castle built by the same Lionheart in 1196-98, overlooking the Seine at Les Andelys in Normandy, designed as an unconquerable bastion, however captured by Philip in 1204 after a 6-month siege, which was definitely extraordinary at the time, but as much as the fortress really was also, not just because of its highly advanced military engineering, but also just out of the strategic value along the Seine, so precluding with its standing the possibility of the French kings sort of campaigning in the lower Strait of the River, symbolizing, in fact, the fall of English Normandy, so to say. This was, again, a grand fortress that is designed by the same Richard. Also, in this case, with the military engineering insights gained during the Crusades, where indeed the same Latins had been quite on the forefront in terms of military technology at large. But it's not like they lacked this knowledge in England already. That's the point that I was talking about before. One bridge was named that occasion in Mercadier's honor. We're told by the Chronicon of William the Breton. This architectural tribute highlighted Mercadier's critical role in Richard's defensive strategy as well. John, unable to depend on the English nobility, relied heavily on mercenaries, which makes, again, in line with the idea of a monarch trying to bypass the oligarchy and making leverage of sort of lower estates absolutely coherent. As I was saying, John was actually a hell of a ruler, and he's not appreciated enough in spite of also the general failure of his continental policy in particular. He died undefeated by the barons in that sense. His commanders in southwestern France included a Gascon. These are the previous ones: Arnold, the Provençal Lupesquer, a variant of Lupacus. And another leader, we don't know whether, I think these were the same identical people like Lupacus Lupesquer, but as we were saying before, there was also a convention regarding this Wolf reference. Another leader was Martin Alguet, died in 1212, a Flemish or Gascon captain who served as a seneschal, that is, in this case, properly royal governor of Gascony and Périgord. These were territories in Aquitaine, Viscounty. Aquitaine, known for its truffles and castles, by the way, rich agricultural land, but as we've seen, not particularly tight. Later, Aglaé joined the crusade against the Albigensian in the south, fought between 1209 and 1229. It was a papal indicted campaign. It was partly supervised and directed campaign against the Catholic heretics of Languedoc, notoriously enough, and more militarily led probably by, as we've seen before, the northern French noblemen, sort of gotten out of the way of Philip II, was successfully battling with his mercenaries, the Angevins in the north. notoriously also resulting in the annexation of Occitania to the French crown over time. There he served the Count of Toulouse, that at different times had complex relations with the same crusaders, to say the least, and for political intrigues, Gleb was captured and hanged by Simon de Montfort, Simon IV de Montfort, 1175-1218, Earl of Leicester, zealous crusader leader who conquered much of Languedoc but died at the siege of Toulouse. You understand how tremendously intricate the picture really is, because if you look at these guys' background, you realize that they straddle the entire France, England, across different religious, linguistic areas. So it's really a complicated, also chaotic time. The Albigensian Crusade really made few videos about the military side of it. If anything, that's an interesting chapter of for our military, not biographies, but stories in general, targeting Cathar heretics, so this dualist Christian sect viewing the material world as evil, right? And enjoying into literal communism, feminism, veganism. I'm not kidding. This is mainstream academic information you can find. Also on the sort of pro-Cathar scholarship on the topic. They literally believed in this. And of course, everybody says, oh, no, it's the evil church who said this about them later. Really? Because we actually have sources from the actual time that tell us pretty concretely what this was about, and this stupid conspiracy theory that everything has to be blended by some evil power when we actually have the even sort of Book of the Saint Cathars telling us essentially what they were preaching. Well, it's something that you can't do without really starting to be a bit more. We don't have much. It's not like we don't have much, but it's not like we don't have the actual evidence either for what we're saying. And this is notorious, by the way. You're not more intelligent than a specialist on the field, also more knowledgeable for that matter on the topic. In any case, we will see that the interesting military side of the story, because the Crusade had witnessed a heavy reliance on mercenary forces due to its brutal and prolonged nature. So actually, as we've seen, Philip Augustus had largely sent his feudal nobility to fight there, but this needed mercenaries to acquire this land on their own, so as free entrepreneur. And as you know, this is also pretty bloody international scenario that the King of Aragon got killed at Muret. The same Simon de Montfort was so successful, one of the great commanders of their era, excellent attack from the flank at Muret. By the way, one of the first witness of that tactics of fully sort of described explicit fashion, conquered almost everything in the south, and then got killed at the siege of Saint Toulouse, apparently like smashed in the head by a mangonel actioned by women. And so everything fell like of his seigneury in the south, and then just the land was exhausted anyway, and gradually later, the time of Louis IX, most of the land was properly acquired, but also by the French crown. In any case, I also made a video about the County of Toulouse. That is an interesting sort of hybrid feudal communal polity in Occitanie. In all this, you have events of the scale of the Magna Carta of 1215, the Great Charter Peace Treaty, de facto forced on John by rebellious barons at Runnymede after the clamorous defeat at the Battle of Bouvines, limiting royal power and establishing legal principles like habeas corpus, forced the king to expel, quote, all foreign knights, crossbowmen, and mercenaries who arrived with arms and horses to harm the land, and banish their leaders. This is exactly what we were saying before about the time of Henry II, right? Brabançons were used in the continent, but could not quite simply be brought to England without kind of great fear, also the same barons. In this case, John, that had just lost basically almost the entire continent in a single blow, had brought sort of much of his soldiers back to England to shield himself against the barons. And you know that also after the Magna Carta, John kept fighting against the barons and so on. I discussed in some videos my general historical, if anything, perspective on the Magna Carta, that surely we should be thankful for the positives of Anglo-Saxon, juridical institutional culture, more would stem from that. But in the moment, the Magna Carta was the product of that disaster, and it also sort of expressed certain juridical principles that were not, say, specifically English in nature. More or less common law was expressed in the same exact context at the time all over Europe, right? Civil law was just barely being recovered in the moment, and in general it would still be treated later as some sort of common law. And again, common law belonged to everyone. Even the same Roman civil law was initially common law. So we will see better what this had meant. Now, the clause 51 of the Magna Carta reflected the barons' deep resentment, this one about properly towards the foreign mercenaries, seen as tools of royal oppression, which can be sort of flipped into, like, look, that the English monarchy was, regardless of the defeat, and even more clamorously in this sense, still faring pretty well as a state, and the power of the monarchy was reflective of great opportunity for England, except they lost at Bouvines. Otherwise everybody would be celebrating John, and how, of course, there would have not been a Magna Carta. Nobody would have even sort of imagined in that context. Of course, things would have gone on with regular constitutions, like, in a sense, the same Magna Carta sort of represented, just in a more radical way, considering the massive and brutal political shift in disfavor of John in the moment. Hugues de Boves died after 1215, was a Flemish knight and mercenary recruiter for Philip Augustus, who had recruited mercenaries before the Battle of Bouvines on July the 27th, 1214. So passing from the French side, we see that, as we were saying before, Philip Augustus had privileged mercenaries as well. And so we see the parallelism between the Angevins, the Capetians. We're doing, essentially, in a monarchic sense, the same identical things. I made multiple videos about the Battle of Bouvines, the Sunday of Bouvines, one of the most momentous clashes in the history of mankind, given especially the political, national sort of entanglement in outcomes of the same engagement, crushing French victory over the Anglo-German coalition that solidified Capetian dominance and weakened John. Well, this Hugues de Boves, after having contributed again to the French cause, literally gathering forces for the Capetians before Bouvines, fled during the same war of that year that was quite tumultuous, fought on multiple fronts. John's strategy wasn't even that bad as a war. In any case, Hugues de Boves fled to England, to stay in England, in a moment in which also England was pretty perturbed by different factions at war with one another now, especially after the battle, and was ordered by the Capetians to send the foreign troops from Dover, so the English port town in Kent, gateway for channel crossing, back to the continent. And this is quite interesting because he had fled in part with these forces, right? And the situation here was pretty much swinging in different directions. There would be also, as you know, in the following years, actually a French invasion of England, the First Barons' War. It's, again, something I'm also preparing that tells a lot about the general picture. In fact, the war with the barons reignited, and John, at this point, rather than also trying to control these other mercenaries that had fled to him from France, hired mercenaries from the Low Countries once again, particularly Louvain, Brabant, and Flanders. Right, Louvain is this Leuven city from the Dutch of Brabant. So, by the way, wealthy lands that were, however, now more than ever at risk of being probably taken over by the French, and already by international recognition under French suzerainty. These areas were pretty coveted by the Capetians, as they were famed for cloth trade and militias as well, so including the same Brabançons, leading, however, these mercenaries from the Low Countries to pillage, plunder, and burn down in England, because these guys had arrived also in the wake, again, in the aftermath of Bouvines, to England, as we've seen, against the barons during the civil war in England. The mercenary leader, Gérard d'Athée, died after 1216, was a ruthless Breton captain, in particular enforcing John's policies in England. He stayed there, and his loyalty to the king made him a target of baronial ire, to say the least. These were pretty brutal confrontations, by the way, as Gérard enforced royal authority with ruthless efficiency. Other leaders operated later during the 13th century under Henry III, 1207-1272, King of England from 1216. Whose minority saw the end of the Barons' War, by the way. He was the son of John. And I made a video about his long reign that changed a big deal in English history, even though he's considered some sort of relatively undertone, a bit too peaceful and generally failing figure. In any case, the father of Edward I, that was the great ruler that only a great England at that point could produce. Some of these leaders under Henry III were Hugues de Boves, died 1225, an Anglo-Norman mercenary captain of crossbowmen. So you see the specialization once again from the namesake town in Normandy. Earning praise with his troops at the Second Battle of Lincoln, fought on May the 20th, 1217, a royalist victory in the First Barons' War that in fact secured Henry III's throne against French-backed rebels, where in the moment in which, in fact, the French had already sent in forces to England and mingling in this civil strife. The Battle of Lincoln, we will make, of course, an entire tactical reconstruction video from primary sources on it, was a turning point, securing, in fact, the eventual royal continuity and further compromise with the barons, but still not the collapse of the system. When banished in 1225, the English recognized de Breteuil's long perilous service to the king and his father as well, John, opting for exile over execution. Because, of course, he could not get away with all the murders that he had carried out, all the plunder for his troops and so on, but he was estimated as a leader, and so he was at least exiled, not to come back to England. And at that point, in fact, the prominence of mercenaries in English royal service declined for a while. If anything, under Henry III, England was mostly peaceful. Just towards the end, when the system collapsed, so basically almost a Jungian, payback, sort of Henry's relatively prudent policy. Things will change once again, as we've seen also in some videos about the later 13th century English army, and in particular Edward I's rule, 1239-1307, King of England from 1272, exactly from the most brutal phase after the Second Barons' War, ignited under his father, known as Longshanks and the Hammer of the Scots for his conquests in the Celtic fringe. Edward had relied on his territorial forces, later, however, augmented by archers from Britain in general. I made lots of videos explaining that the Welsh, regardless of their great numbers at this point, especially after the conquest of their country by Edward, so that had broken their society in many ways and left much of these men without much other option than enlisting as mercenaries, were to become more proper soldiery. Right? English archers were likely majority and also better paid than Welsh ones. So actually the myth perpetuated by some misuse of certain ethnographic sources that the Welsh would have sort of been more proficient with longbow, more advanced English, has been completely debunked by historiography. There is no evidence for it, and it's just a bad, again, misunderstanding of the sources. Nevertheless, overall, like the English, I made a video about English and Welsh warfare between the 11th and 14th century to give just a broader spectrum, diachronically and comparatively. their valor for our regional warfare series, would be increasingly important in English armies of the 13th and 14th century, playing a major role in the fullest exploitation in the armies of Edward III, the greatest and the most complete military genius in English history, the grandson of Edward I. And that's a completely different era today we're not going to discuss, but just for showing how, again, the term mercenary is sort of relatively debatable. Soldiers are, let's say, as long as they're paid and they can be ruthlessly efficient in many ways, the national affiliation doesn't really count too much. Like, you can have nationals that are as heartless and predatory as foreigners. In any case, if anything, this is a topic we will see better on another occasion. Looking again at the French side, Philip Augustus in particular, early in his reign, understood what had already been basically a leitmotif in Capetian attempt at military expansion, reform, etc. Abbot Suger, very famous abbot of Saint-Denis, the outskirts of Paris at the time, regent for Louis VII, by the way. We're talking 1081-1151, key reformer of Capetian administration, and notable also for his radical intuitions in the development of Gothic architecture, also coming apart from England at the time, because that's where really probably the concept of Gothic originated. Then France had more resources simply to build on it, but this was a great man and a great prelate as much as a man of state, you can argue. Would note, during Louis VI's reign, I made a video about, by the way, Louis VI's campaigns. We're talking 1081. He was born roughly in the same year, the same years of Suger, and died in 1137. King of France from 1108, nicknamed the Fat, right, who centralized royal power in the Ile-de-France. That's the necessity of some professional troops surpassing the sort of ideal rather than traditional means of feudal recruitment that were incredibly limiting and costly and farraginous, etc. Here, everything stepped up together with, for example, French religious architecture. Like, when you see Gothic cathedrals, you know that there is also a state that is taking off thanks to the fat and rich soil of the Ile-de-France, both in agricultural resources and in quarries for the very particular porous stones that had to make sort of the Gothic magic of walls of light. All right, had realized that in the clashes, by the way, that with Louis VI, with William II, roughly 1056, 1100, so King of England from 1087, son of William the Conqueror, whose aggressive expansionism clashed, in fact, with the French interests, that the English kings, with their vast revenues, could, in the moment, as probably expressed in Suger's Vita Ludovici Grossi Regis, so literally the biography of his own king, could hire more knights than their French counterparts. That was, again, a time of before the White shipwreck, the civil war, like the entire issues with Stephen Matilda that we were recalling before. Really a might to be reckoned with. That's when, probably in relative terms, let's say at least the Anglo-Norman system was most updated in some institutional terms. There are some historiographical debates, because for a while we thought that the Normans taking over these lands in a quite direct, say in Britain, in a quite direct way, simply had sort of a freer hand to reorganize everything in more central terms. Seeming things were less efficient than previously thought, but there is no doubt that, considering the extent of the French crown possessions at the time, the English were faring, the Anglo-Normans, to say better, were faring pretty well, right, in comparison. In we're talking Philip II's chronicler, so let's project ourselves a couple of generations later once again. Rigaud, that we mentioned before, died roughly in 1220, was a monk of Saint-Denis, where, as you know, also a great part of the prestige and the mystique of the French monarchy stemmed from Saint-Denis is France, and France is Saint-Denis. Right? There is no France outside of Saint-Denis. An official biographer is on turn of chronicle Philip's reign in the Gesta Philippi Augusti, we have used him prominently also for the Battle of Bouvines, obviously enough, notes that Philip levied heavy taxes on the clergy at that point, amassed wealth across various locations, and lived modestly. There's all a game that I've made for, if I'm not wrong, it was Louis VI's also policy towards the Commune of Laon, the aforementioned mechanism increasing, sort of allowing for the expansion of the Third Estate's autonomy to counter the bishops and the other, also the lay princes that ruled, that had some sort of shared lordship over these growing towns in northeastern France, where also, in fact, some of them in the towns, at the centers of the cities, if you prefer, at the seat of the diocese, had some of the most powerful, and also initially king-backing archbishops that, however, as the Ile-de-France was growing in power, hoped that they would maintain some ever more entrenched immunities and privileges, and instead the King of France had the capacity eventually to take over the entire system. Also thanks, as we've seen, to individuals like Suger that, were more than some random prelates, by the way. And yet, as we've seen, this source, Rigord, literally states that the Saint Philip lived modestly. Naturally, we don't have to imagine modestly in a sense of poor here. There is a bit of saintly, as we've seen, sacred royalty in the air. There was all a mystique of the French mark. These men were great knights. They had a pretty strong sense of the imperial Catholic tradition and how to lead it, to enact it. Remember that Philip officiated the Mass himself as a sacred ruler before the Battle of Bouvines. There was quite a premise for the eventual victory. So there is a lot of savings, in other words. The same Capetians have to tighten their belts, they have to rationalize, organize, etc. They were already quite powerful, admittedly. Their power does not to be understated. It's not like they control even just the Ile-de-France. As a matter of fact, there were many crown lands and or sort of Capetian branches. Think about the Duchy of Burgundy. Already at the time was a very advanced and at that point loyal, unlike during the 100 Years' War, power toward the Capetians. Well, Philip stated that his predecessors' poverty prevented them from hiring knights in time of need, so an absolute poverty of the monarchy, causing the kingdom to contract through wars, which indeed had been happening together with the rise of these princely powers, including the Angevins. Philip thus gathered wealth to protect and potentially expand his realm, not primarily, as Rigord suggests, to reclaim the Holy Land, but still to, in fact, establish a pretty sound, subtle base. It's not like Philip, again, simply started taxation and, before his predecessors had not sort of exacted a tribute, levies, and so on. But resources were more. Now the French king had the means also to enact things with force, and he would not spare that in order to concentrate more power. In fact, obviously the opponents of Philip Augustus, given also his clamorous success and de facto opening to the Capetian lordship over the entirety of France, roughly almost today's borders and extent in particular, labeled him overly ambitious and greedy, which is also what the standard sort of coin flipping, if you want to sort of demonize someone, putting him in a bad light. Philip's revenues, just to give you an idea of the figures here, grew from about 30,000 pounds Parisian annually to, say, at accession, to an estimated 50,000 by his death. It's a great income. And as you understand, it's not even directly proportional to the actual land, say, domains extension. But in fact, it's not simply like you extend so much and you can grab equally, right, in proportion. But the important was securing a core, and then from that consolidating further and gradually also in the branching out in these other provinces. He funded also, by the way, not just the military, but administrative reforms like salaried bailiffs and seneschals. So some specific royal agents and administrators, officials that could, in fact, exercise justice, like collect taxes and so on in the provinces. Though claims of £1,200 daily are hyperbolic and may have happened because none of this was fully steady, right? So you could have a good day in which you could definitely gather a lot of wealth, but that was not typical, and it was often ad hoc still done, right? At first, Philip Augustus hired mercenaries only for specific campaigns, such as against the Count of Sancerre, that is Stephen I, died 1191, a rebellious vassal who had ravaged the Orléanais. It's also pretty close to the Capetian Courland in 1184. In 1181, and this had happened, and Philip of Alsace, the aforementioned tournament master, Count of Flanders he lived in between 1143 and 1191, who was Count from 1168, a powerful ally, by the way, the same Henry II of England, who contested Vermandois in the northeast in 1184. So pretty intense clashes that, as we've seen, the Capetians had to fence off from multiple directions. Almost like this pincer movement from Flanders, from Aquitaine. In 1187, at Châteauroux, a town in Berry, he dismissed his mercenaries under a religious pretext. It also had to do with these tensions with the Cathars all across the country. The next year, Philip sent unneeded German mercenaries to Bourges, the capital of Berry, this fortified episcopal city. It's the old Avaricum, by the way, see of the Bituriges, hence Bourges, for payment, only to disarm them, seize their horses and money, and expel them. After all, they were Germans. This was also a profitable way to keep your own troops, and that's also what could happen to you as a mercenary in the service of a powerful king. Right? Isolated in a foreign country, there were persuasive means to oblige the Germans to be spoiled and abandoned to leave. This happened also in other contexts, also with prisoners of war. There are, at the Battle of Parabiago, we'll have to see that at some point. Malherbe, the German, etc. Consider that also in strictly natural terms. I mean, a war horse, like the equipment, until the mid-13th century, economy was largely based, you can say largely based on barter as if monetization did not exist, but I mean at large, like natural resources were much more appreciated rather than the amount of money was not even so fluidly around. Here we're witnessing to the rise of more professionally paid troops as opposed to simple vassals answering the call of the king. They would still do, but just for their own political interest and so other. So I don't know, infeudation, conquest, loot, and so on. In small quantities, that the monarchies were with great effort, as we understood here, bureaucratic administrators starting to afford. As Philip's revenues later increased significantly, including the exaggeration of 1,200 Parisian pounds daily by the end of his reign, and especially during the critical clash with Richard Lionheart, the French king employed Cadoc. Lambert Cadoc died after 1227. He was a Welsh archer turned mercenary captain, originally recruited by the same Richard of England, but who defected to Philip in 1194, in fact, becoming a trusted royal commander, right? Serving permanently and gaining fame comparable to Mercadier, this time, however, from the side of the Capetians. The Chronicle of the Bethune Anonymous is talking about Cadoc in these terms. Cadoc, who in 1196 defended Gaillon, a castle on the Seine in Normandy, yet another key frontier fort against Richard, as we've seen in the earlier brutal clashes with 300 infantry. Cadoc's troops were the first to breach Château-Gaillard, as we've seen Richard's major fortress near Les Andelys. In fact, there were two twin towns, the Grand and Petit Andelys, properly located on a Seine meander that from the top of Château-Gaillard, that as you know still exists, you can beautifully admire along the river. towards Normandy, and this was probably the strategic axis to Rouen, right, the ducal capital of Normandy, major port and ecclesiastical center, beautiful city, by the way, together with Caen, which in fact Philip captured in 1204 after a 6-month siege, described by William de Breton in his Chronicle. This is how the Capetians secured, for example, Normandy, that was lost completely to the English at that point. That also was a hell of an ideological blow because of this happened under John, telling the truth, because John first lost this territory after a defeat, and then he attempted in 1214 again the invasion, right? But Normandy, that had been the seat of the house of Normandy, that after all, even the Plantagenets in female line descended from, not only because there had been a great intermarriage there, was lost. It's a symbol of the same conquest of England. It's over here of almost insularization of English policy, which happened chiefly during Henry III. John at least tried to take it back, and he failed. Cadoc later also took Angers, which was at this point he said the house of probably the ruling dynasty by male line in England, the Angevins. William the Breton talks about this as well. And heavy blow again. Anjou will, as we've seen in our original historical series, become a very important principality, owning the peerage, by the way, of the Kingdom of France, and will take a different direction, a Mediterranean one, as you know. Favored by Philip, Cadoc was entrusted with Les Andelys in 1214 and appointed Burgrave of Gaillon and bailiff of Pont-Audemer, a Norman town with bridges over the Rille River, an administrative hub. Around 1210, Cadoc was sent to Auvergne, as we've seen in the heartland of Gaul, to confront its count, Guy II, died 1227, who had been raiding churches in defiance of royal authority. In fact, making attacking clergy, plundering churches. There was some smell of Occitania, almost, of Andalusia in the air, together with Catharism. And these were essentially Occitanian powers that were trying to resist the Capetian concentration force. Here, things were, again, obviously collapsing as far as any possibility of the South to remain virtually independent, as it had done so because of the general restriction of the Western Frankish monarchy up to a short time ago. In 1213, Cadoc joined the Flanders invasion that went on also for another year, part of Philip's wars to subdue the county. And 6 years later, due to various offenses, he was, however, imprisoned until 1227, losing all he had gained from Philip II Augustus. During his successor, Louis VIII, 1187-1226, King of France from 1223, who continued the Albigensian Crusade, Avignon, in the Venaisons, besieged in 1226 during the Crusade, was again part of the broader efforts of the French crown to subdue the region. Cadoc re-emerged as a leader, but without mercenary forces at this point. Maintaining Cadoc and his small band, after all, had been expensive. As we've seen, these mercenaries, even alone, if it were in the hundreds, were still, again, professional forces that cost compared to the average sort of feudal levy. That was something you could do with militia, with, again, even peasant levies, something like that. You could arm them. Again, the notion that medieval armies were just about ill-equipped peasants is not really accurate in general. But these small forces were also some critical ones in the general picture that could be employed as a spearhead, as breakthrough force. Some again garrisoned as well. So they had an all-round reliability, at least in terms of military standards. William the Breton, who died, by the way, in 1226, we're looking at the same identical, almost lifespans of these protagonists. William de Berton was a Norman chronicler and chaplain to Philip Augustus. Exaggerates that Cadoc received £1,000 daily. Though on one occasion, £4,400 was paid to him. These were astronomical ciphers, especially considering the relatively scarce numerical consistency of Cadoc's forces. So the idea, especially also in his in terms of as an obsequium to his general service, is that he definitely knew how to gain a kingly favor together with other names that we've seen here. And this reflects the evolving times that will head towards, in fact, military, let's say, mercenary companies, let's say, properly professional, permanent, or semi-permanent groups that would go adventure. They were essentially the evolution of the previous war bands, nothing really specific, but ever more permanently subsidized, involved in this larger scale warfare, in fact, becoming also ever more efficient and dynamic and so on. So it's and growing also in number at some point, because there was a minimal entrepreneurship from their side. Think about the condottieri later on. They had entire armies of tens of thousands probably serving as statal forces de facto. So here we are in the almost the initial phase of the more strictly paid, permanently paid recognition, or at least permanently, I mean long term or medium term, but still something in fact that was normally longer than the already typically paid vassalatic performance, and in theory, just because of the prepaid logic of the vassalatic beneficiary system, should have provided a military service without being paid, and instead this was what the actual dynamic had come to. And again, there is a lot to really appreciate regarding this story's general meaning and how they affected gradually, if anything, from an administrative organizational point of view, the Western art of war during the Middle Ages. I was glad to talk about the Brabançons a bit and these other mercenary leaders, because mercenary, say, warfare is, as we said before, more almost a convention, right, a relic of some Renaissance and nationalist, say, 19th century nationalist feeling towards, in fact, non-national forces, and so prejudices that were at some point cultivated only in later times. However, their historical development is very much akin to, I mean, it was actual soldiery in some of the most straightforwardly, let's say, effective and tendentially, again, now cohesively strengthening fashion for any other soldier to be modeled on. And again, we made lots of videos about the also this conditions of service, the pay, and so on. I made 24 videos. This is the 25th about mercenary warfare. You can find it in the relative playlist on my channel. It's also relatively watched for that matter, because again, there is the idea that the mercenary is just the evil yet cool brute that sort of surpassed all the other conventional forces, and there is always this anti-establishment mentality that still pervades in the most forte nature of sort of masses taste also when approach history. This is really different. Most of these soldiers at some point were fully controlled, as we've seen also by the monarchs. They didn't have a chance here, for example, to overthrow or whatever. In times of crisis, similar things could happen anyway. However, again, there would probably be more to say, but here we are really concretizing an important level of military historical sort of scoping in online that I think no other channel has ever done, right, from quite a while compared to what I've been doing here. Nevertheless, again, there is still much to do. We are technically still at the beginning, and so let's simply go on with patience and awareness about the situation. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.